David lived in a quiet neighborhood where every street looked the same. The houses had neat lawns, white fences, and trees lined on both sides. For him, this house was not only bricks and wood. It was a place filled with memories of his late wife, gentle evenings with his daughter when she was younger, and the many years of hard work that had finally given him a space he could call his own. He had bought the house with pride. It was modest, not too big, not too fancy, but to David it was everything. He enjoyed simple routines. Every morning he brewed his coffee, sat by the window and watched sunlight spread across the garden. That small garden carried the roses his wife had planted years ago. He kept them alive with care, watering them each evening, almost as if keeping a piece of her still close. The house was not just shelter. It was his history, his peace, his reminder of love. One summer morning, as he returned from the mailbox with bills and local newsletters, his eyes caught a large envelope stamped with bold letters. It was from the Homeowners Association, the HOA. At first, he thought it was another friendly notice reminding people about lawn maintenance or community events. He opened it casually without fear. But as he read, his hand trembled. It was a demand for payment, not just a small fee. The letter claimed he owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA dues and penalties. The words felt heavy, harsh, almost threatening. David frowned and read it again, slower this time, to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. He had always paid his bills. He was careful about money, never late on utilities or property taxes. How could he suddenly owe so much? He sat down at the kitchen table, the paper shaking in his hand. Confusion clouded his mind. This must be a mistake, he whispered to himself. He decided to call the HOA office immediately, the call that changed his day. The phone rang a few times before a woman's sharp voice answered. Homeowners Association office. This is Karen speaking. David tried to stay calm. Hello, my name is David Miller. I just received a letter saying I owe thousands in fees. I think there has been a mistake. Karen's voice carried no warmth. There is no mistake, Mr. Miller. Our records show you are behind on multiple payments. You signed the agreement when you bought your house. You should know the rules, David frowned. I've always paid what I was supposed to. I don't remember anything about these extra fees. Karen sighed loudly as if she was already tired of him. Rules are rules. Ignorance is not an excuse. You either pay or there will be consequences. Her tone stung him. It wasn't the kind of conversation he expected. He thought the HOA existed to help keep the community safe and organized, not to scare homeowners. Can you send me a breakdown of these charges? David asked, trying to remain polite. You already have the letter, Karen replied coldly. Everything you need is there. And before he could say another word, the line went silent. She had hung up. David sat there stunned. The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it had shaken him deeply. He placed the phone down slowly, staring at it as if it might explain what had just happened. Memories and worries. That night, sleep refused to come. David lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He remembered when he and his wife had first moved in. She had been so excited about the house. She painted the kitchen walls a soft yellow and planted flowers along the walkway. Their daughter, only 6 at the time, had run up and down the hallway laughing. Those memories gave him strength, but now they felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. He turned his head toward the window and looked out at the street. Everything appeared calm under the streetlights, but inside his chest there was a storm. Why would the HOA suddenly come after him? And why did Karen sound like she enjoyed making him nervous? The idea of losing his home was too much to bear. This house was not just about comfort. It carried his wife's presence, the last touch of her life before illness had taken her. To leave it would be like losing her all over again, searching for answers. The next day, David pulled out the thick folder where he kept all his important documents. He sat at the dining table surrounded by papers, his mortgage, tax receipts, payment records, even the original agreement with the HOA. Hours passed as he compared the letter to his old records. He could not find a single sign that he owed what they claimed. The fees they listed in the letter seemed made up. There were charges for community beautification, special assessments, and late penalties that had doubled. But he had never received any notice about these before. As the sun set, frustration filled him. He muttered under his breath, "How can they do this? How can they just make up numbers?" Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet fear whispered that maybe the HOA had power he didn't understand. Maybe they really could take his house. The encounter with Karen later that week, while watering the garden, David saw Karen walking down the street. She was dressed neatly, holding a clipboard, greeting some neighbors with a smile. But when her eyes met David's, her smile vanished, replaced by a firm, almost smug expression. He decided to approach her. "Excuse me, Karen, can we talk about that letter?" She stopped, tilted her head, and crossed her arms. "Mr. Miller, I told you on the phone. You need to pay your dues. Everyone else manages to follow the rules. Why can't you?" David clenched his jaw. "Because I don't owe what you're saying I owe. I've checked my papers. None of this makes sense." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You signed the agreement when you bought this house. If you didn't read it properly, that's your problem. The HOA board has voted. If you don't pay, we will take action." Her words were sharp, her tone final, like a judge giving a sentence. David's heart pounded. "This is my home. You can't just take it away." Karen gave a thin smile. "Business is business. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." Then she walked away, leaving David frozen on his lawn, clutching the garden hose with shaking hands, loneliness and fear. That evening, David sat in his living room, the letter still on the coffee table. The television was on, but he wasn't watching. His mind replayed every word Karen had spoken. Her cold voice echoed in his ears, stronger than the sound of the TV. For the first time in years, David felt truly alone. The house that had once been a place of comfort now felt threatened. He picked up the framed photo of his wife from the shelf. Looking into her gentle eyes, he whispered, "What am I going to do?" He thought about his daughter, now grown and living in another city. He didn't want to burden her with his problems. She had her own life, her own challenges, but a part of him longed to hear her voice, to have someone by his side in this storm. That night, as he turned off the lights and walked to his bedroom, he paused by the front door. He looked at the lock, the frame, the familiar doorway. "This is my home," he said firmly to himself. "I won't let them take it." But even as he said it, fear crawled into his heart. Somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The days after David's meeting with Karen were heavy with unease. Every time he walked past his mailbox, his chest tightened, fearing another envelope stamped with the bold HOA logo. The neighborhood around him seemed peaceful. Children riding bicycles, neighbors mowing lawns, dogs barking in the distance. Yet for him, the world had changed. His house no longer felt secure. It was as though invisible hands were pulling it away from him piece by piece. Each evening he checked his documents again, searching for any mistake that could explain the sudden debt. But no matter how many times he reviewed them, the answer was the same. He had paid everything he was supposed to. The fees the HOA demanded were not in any of his papers, yet despite his certainty, a shadow of fear stayed in his heart. What if the HOA had power he didn't fully understand? What if they really could take his home, no matter how unfair it was? The second letter a week later, another envelope appeared. This one was sharper, the tone inside harsher. The letter said he was now seriously delinquent and warned that legal action would begin if payment was not made within 30 days. At the bottom, in bold letters, it read, "Foreclosure proceedings may be initiated." David read the words again and again. His hands felt cold, his breath shallow. Foreclosure. The word itself felt like thunder. Losing his home was no longer just a possibility. It was now a threat written in black and white. He sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his grip. His heart pounded with both anger and fear. He wanted to tear the paper apart, but he also knew he needed it as proof. Proof that this nightmare was not imagined. Seeking help, the next morning David decided to seek advice. He drove into town to speak with a local lawyer. The office was small but welcoming, lined with books and certificates on the wall. A kind-looking man named Mr. Harris greeted him and asked to see the letters. David explained everything, his voice carrying both frustration and desperation. Mr. Harris read through the documents carefully, his brow furrowing. After a long silence, he looked at David with concern. "These charges look questionable," Mr. Harris said slowly, "but HOAs can be tricky. They sometimes have broad powers in their agreements. Did you sign anything when you bought the house?" David nodded. "Yes, but I've gone through all my papers." "Nothing mentions these extra fees." Then there may be a case, Mr. Harris replied, tapping his pen on the desk. But fighting an HOA can be difficult. They often have more resources, and many homeowners don't challenge them. Are you ready for a long fight? David swallowed hard. The thought of court, legal costs, and endless stress scared him. But what scared him more was the idea of losing his home. He nodded firmly. I don't want to lose my house. I'll fight. Mr. Harris gave a small smile of encouragement. Then we'll start by sending them a formal letter requesting proof of these charges. That will be the first step. David left the office with a flicker of hope, but the weight on his shoulders remained. He knew Karen would not back down easily. The neighborhood whispers. As the days passed, David began to notice something else. Neighbors who once waved warmly now avoided eye contact. He heard whispers when he walked past, felt the silence that followed him. It was as if Karen's shadow stretched over everyone. One evening, as he watered his roses, a neighbor named Linda approached quietly. She looked around nervously before speaking. David, she said in a low voice, I heard about what's happening with the HOA. You're not the first. They did something similar to the Thompsons a few years ago. Charged them strange fees, then foreclosed when they couldn't pay. Karen bought their house at auction for almost nothing. David's heart tightened. Why didn't anyone say anything? Linda sighed. Most people are afraid. The HOA controls so much here. Fines, penalties, even access to community services. Speaking against them can make life very hard. Her words chilled him. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using them as weapons. Karen's visit one Saturday afternoon, David was repairing a loose fence board in his yard when he saw Karen walking toward him. Clipboard in hand, sharp eyes fixed on him. Mr. Miller, she began, her voice firm but polite on the surface. I hope you've considered resolving your debt. It would be unfortunate for this to go further. David straightened, gripping his hammer tightly. I don't owe you what you're claiming. I've spoken to a lawyer. We'll challenge this. Karen's smile was thin, almost mocking. You can try, of course. But the board has rules. We follow them carefully. Courts usually side with us. It would be a shame to waste money on lawyers when you could simply pay and move on. Her calmness unnerved him. It was as if she already knew she would win. This is my home, David said firmly, his voice trembling only slightly. I won't let you take it. Karen tilted her head, her eyes cold. We'll see. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the sidewalk, leaving David standing stiff with both fear and determination, the weight of isolation. That night, David sat in his living room staring at the foreclosure warning. He felt isolated, cut off from the community he once trusted. The walls around him seemed to close in, pressing down with invisible force. He picked up the phone several times, thinking of calling his daughter, but each time he put it down again. He didn't want to worry her. Instead, he poured his energy into his garden. Each evening, he tended to the roses, pulling weeds, trimming leaves, watering carefully. The flowers reminded him of his wife, her laughter and her warmth. They gave him strength, even as the storm outside his control grew darker. Another blow 2 weeks later, a third letter arrived. This one was even more alarming. It stated that foreclosure proceedings had officially begun. A date was set for an auction if the debt was not paid in full. David's hands shook as he read. The words blurred as his eyes filled with tears. They were really doing it. They were going to take his house. He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, the thought of losing everything felt real. He whispered to the empty room, "What am I going to do?" But after a long silence, he lifted his head. His eyes, though wet, carried a spark of resolve. He would not surrender easily. Gathering strength, the next morning, David drove back to Mr. Harris's office, carrying the new letter. The lawyer studied it carefully and sighed. They're moving fast, Mr. Harris said, but we can file an objection and demand a court review. It won't stop them completely, but it may delay the process. Delay is enough, David said. Every day I can fight is a day I keep my home. Mr. Harris nodded. Then that's what we'll do. But be prepared, it's going to get harder. David left the office with mixed feelings. The road ahead was steep, but at least he was no longer standing alone. He had someone by his side, even if the odds were against him. Closing of Part 2A's night fell, David sat once more in his garden, the scent of roses filling the air. He looked at his home, the windows glowing softly in the dusk. Fear still weighed on him, but determination had begun to take root. The HOA wanted him gone. Karen wanted his house. But David knew one truth that gave him strength. He had done nothing wrong. And sometimes, even against powerful enemies, that truth could be a shield. The battle for his home had begun, and though the path was dark, David vowed he would walk it until the very end. The weeks that followed were filled with tension and sleepless nights for David. Every sunrise brought him closer to the day written in the foreclosure notice, the auction of his home. Despite the efforts of Mr. Harris, the lawyer, the HOA pushed forward. Their letters continued, their tone colder each time, as if they were counting down the days until his house would no longer be his. David tried to keep his spirit strong, but inside, he was breaking. He spent his days walking through each room of the house, touching the walls, remembering the moments they had held. The kitchen still carried faint traces of his wife's favorite recipes. The living room echoed with memories of his daughter's laughter, and the garden bloomed with roses that had outlived the one who planted them. These were not just spaces. They were pieces of his heart. The night before the auction, David sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea untouched beside him. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each sound reminding him of the passing time. His papers lay scattered across the table, letters from the HOA, legal documents, and notes from his lawyer. He read them again, even though he already knew what they said. His mind searched desperately for a loophole, some mistake he could use to stop what was coming. But no matter how many times he went through them, the result stayed the same. Unless something miraculous happened, tomorrow he would lose his home. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them away.
He told himself he needed to be strong.
"This house is part of me," he whispered. "They can take it, but they will never take the memories." Before going to bed, he walked through the house slowly, almost like a farewell tour. He touched the yellow-painted kitchen walls, the soft curtains his wife had chosen, the old armchair by the window where he often sat with a book. In the garden, he knelt by the roses, letting his hand rest gently on the petals. "I'll fight for you," he promised quietly, his voice breaking. The auction morning. The morning of the auction arrived cold and gray, as if the sky itself shared his sorrow. David wore his best jacket, though his hands trembled as he buttoned it. He knew he had to go. He could not just hide at home while strangers decided the fate of his house. The auction was held in a community hall near the courthouse. When David arrived, he saw a crowd already gathered. Some were investors, their sharp eyes scanning the lists of properties. Others were curious neighbors whispering among themselves. The atmosphere was businesslike for most, but for David it was the most personal battle of his life. He took a seat in the back, his heart pounding. He looked around nervously, and then he saw her. Karen stood near the front, clipboard in hand, her expression calm but triumphant. She glanced back, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment she gave him a thin smile, as if reminding him she already knew how the day would end. The bidding begins, the auctioneer. A tall man in a suit stepped onto the stage and began calling out the list of properties. Each house was introduced quickly, bids were placed, and ownership shifted with the raise of a hand. David barely heard the first few auctions. His mind was locked on one thing, waiting for his address to be called. His palms were sweaty and his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. Then it came. "Next property," the auctioneer announced. 3-bedroom home located on Maple Street. David's heart nearly stopped. That was his house. The auctioneer began. Starting bid, $50,000. David's breath caught in his throat. His home was worth far more than that. He had poured years of savings and effort into it, and now it was being sold for the price of a car. His fists tightened, but he knew he had no power to stop it. A man in the crowd raised his hand. $55,000, the auctioneer called. Another person raised their hand. $60,000. The numbers began to climb slowly, though still far below the home's true value. David watched in silence, his body stiff, his heart breaking. Each bid felt like a knife cutting deeper. Karen's move, and then Karen raised her hand. $70,000, the auctioneer called. Her voice was calm, confident, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. The room grew quieter. Few wanted to compete with the HOA president. Some investors glanced at her and lowered their eyes, unwilling to challenge someone who clearly held influence. Another man hesitated, then offered 75. Karen raised her hand again without hesitation. 80. The man shook his head and lowered his hand, giving up. Silence filled the room for a moment. The auctioneer looked around. Any higher bids? No one moved, going once, going twice, sold. The hammer came down. The house, David's house, was now hers. The crushing moment, David sat frozen in his chair. His ears rang, drowning out the sounds of the room. The auctioneer's words replayed in his mind. Sold, it was over. Just like that, his home belonged to Karen, the woman who had threatened him, ignored his pleas, and treated him as if he were nothing. Now stood victorious. Karen turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again. This time her smile was wider, colder. She mouthed the words, "Business is business." David felt his chest tighten. He wanted to shout, to stand and demand justice, but his voice failed him. The strength in his body seemed to drain away, leaving him numb. After the auction, when the auction ended, people filed out, chatting casually as if they had just bought groceries or supplies. For them, it was business. For David, it was the end of a chapter in his life. He walked outside slowly, the cool air hitting his face. The world looked the same, cars passing, birds flying overhead, but for him nothing was the same anymore. He leaned against his car, trying to breathe. His lawyer, Mr. Harris, came out a few minutes later. His expression was heavy with sympathy. "I'm sorry, David," he said softly. "We did what we could, but the system moved too fast." David nodded, though he could barely find words. His throat felt dry, his voice trapped. Finally, he managed to whisper, "She took it." Mr. Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't the end. We can still fight in court. If she used illegal methods, we may prove it. But today was hard." David gave a small nod, though his heart was breaking. He got into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly before driving away. The drive home. The drive back to his house felt surreal. Every corner, every familiar sight carried the knowledge that soon it would no longer be his. His hands trembled on the wheel and tears blurred his vision, but he kept going. When he pulled into the driveway, he sat for a long time, staring at the home he had just lost. The windows glowed softly in the evening light. The roses in the garden swayed in the breeze. It all looked so peaceful, so ordinary, yet it carried the weight of tragedy. He finally stepped out of the car, his legs heavy, and walked slowly to the front door. Each step felt like walking deeper into a farewell he wasn't ready to face. Closing of Part 3. That night, David stood in the garden under the stars. He touched the roses gently, his heart aching. He whispered, "I won't let this be the end. Somehow I'll find a way." Though Karen had won the auction and though his home was now under her name, David knew the fight was not finished. The battle for justice was only beginning. The morning after the auction, David woke up with a heaviness in his chest. Sunlight poured through the window, but it felt dull, as if the world had lost its color. For years, mornings in this house had given him peace. The smell of coffee, the gentle hum of the garden outside, the quiet safety of walls that carried his history. But now even the sunlight felt like a stranger. His home was no longer his. It belonged to Karen, packing memories. The days that followed were filled with quiet sorrow. David walked through each room slowly, carrying boxes and wrapping fragile items. Every object had a story. The ceramic vase on the shelf had been a gift from his wife. The yellow curtains were her choice. The old armchair in the corner was where he had read bedtime stories to his daughter. Packing these items was not just a task. It was a journey through memories. Each piece reminded him of laughter, love, and moments he thought would last forever. Now he was forced to fold them into cardboard boxes, as if trying to contain emotions too big for any space. He tried to move carefully, but sometimes his hands shook. At one point, while packing a small framed photo of his wife holding their daughter as a child, he stopped and sat down. His eyes filled with tears and he whispered, "I'm sorry, I couldn't protect it." The silence of the house felt heavier with every passing hour. Neighbors watching. As the news spread, neighbors began to notice. Some looked on with sympathy when they saw him carrying boxes to his car. Others avoided him, afraid of attracting Karen's attention. The community was trapped in a quiet fear of the HOA. One afternoon, while David was loading books into his trunk, Linda approached again. Her eyes were filled with sadness. "You don't deserve this," she said softly. "We all know how unfair it is." David gave a small, tired smile. Knowing doesn't change it. Linda hesitated before adding, "If you ever need a place to stay, my brother has a spare room outside the neighborhood. Just don't give up." Her kindness touched him, but he felt too broken to respond fully. He thanked her and returned to his boxes. The last walk, the hardest part, came when the moving day arrived. David knew he had to leave. His lawyer had explained there was no more time. Karen now owned the property. That morning, David walked through the house one last time. His footsteps echoed in the empty rooms. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemons from the cleaner he had used the night before. The living room looked bare, the walls marked by the absence of family photos. He paused in the hallway where his daughter had once taped her drawings to the wall. The tape marks were still faintly visible. He ran his hand over them, remembering the sound of her laughter. Finally, he stepped into the garden. The roses stood tall, their petals glowing in the sunlight. He bent down and touched them gently, his fingers brushing the soft petals as tears rolled down his cheeks. "This was your gift," he whispered, speaking to the memory of his wife. "I will carry it with me." The departure. When the last box was loaded, David stood by the front door. He stared at the frame, the same doorway he had walked through thousands of times. It had welcomed him after long days of work. It had been the place where his wife once greeted him with a smile. Now it was the door through which he would leave forever. He placed his hand on the doorframe and closed his eyes for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped outside and locked the door. The key felt heavy in his hand, heavier than ever before. He slid it into an envelope for Karen, placed it in the mailbox, and walked to his car. Neighbors watched from a distance. Some whispered, some simply stood silently. No one stopped him, no one interfered. David started the engine, and as the car rolled forward, he looked at his home through the rearview mirror. The sight blurred with tears. He whispered a final goodbye and drove away. Loneliness on the road. The road stretched endlessly in front of him. He had no clear destination, only the need to keep moving. His belongings filled the car, but the weight of loss was heavier than any box. Every mile away from his house felt like a knife twisting deeper in his heart. He stopped at a small diner on the highway. Sitting at a booth, he stared at the menu but could not eat. The waitress poured him coffee and asked kindly, "Rough day?" David gave a small nod. Something like that. She didn't ask more, and he was grateful. He sipped the coffee slowly, feeling the bitterness match the ache inside. Nights without home in the weeks that followed, David stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room smelled of old paint and damp carpet. The bed was stiff, the walls thin. At night he heard voices from other rooms, doors slamming, traffic passing outside. It was not home. It was just a place to exist. Each evening he sat at the small desk in the room, staring at the boxes piled in the corner. His most precious belongings, photos, books, little keepsakes, were safe. But without the house, they felt incomplete, like puzzle pieces missing their frame. He often walked outside at night looking at the stars. Under the open sky, he whispered to himself, "I will not give up. I can't let them win." Memories as strength. One night, he pulled out a photo album from the box. Page by page, he flipped through pictures of his wife and daughter. Smiles, birthdays, small moments of joy captured forever. Each photo reminded him why the house had meant so much. But instead of crushing him, the memories began to fuel him. "They can take the house," he said softly, "but they can't take what it meant. And I'll fight so no one else has to go through this." The thought gave him a strange strength. The sorrow was still there, but underneath it, determination was beginning to grow. News of Karen. One afternoon, while drinking coffee at the motel lobby, David overheard two men talking. They mentioned Karen's name. "She bought another house at auction," one said. "Got it for dirt cheap again." David's ears sharpened. This was not just about him. Karen had been doing this to others too. He realized Linda's words were true. He was not alone. The anger that had been sitting quietly in his chest now flared into something stronger. He decided it was time to dig deeper. If Karen had built a pattern of taking homes unfairly, then maybe, just maybe, he could expose her. The spark of hope that night. David called Mr. Harris. His voice carried both pain and new resolve. "She's done this before," he said firmly. "I want to gather evidence. If I lost my house, I won't let others go through the same thing." Mr. Harris listened carefully and replied, "If we can prove a pattern of abuse, the court may finally listen. It won't be easy, but you're right. It's bigger than just your home. David closed his eyes and nodded. For the first time since leaving his house, he felt a flicker of purpose. His loss was real, his sorrow deep, but maybe it could lead to something larger. Maybe his fight could bring justice. Closing of Part 4A's David lay in the motel bed that night. The room still felt cold and unfamiliar. But his heart, though broken, carried a new flame. He had lost his house, the place that held his memories. He had endured the pain of leaving behind the roses, the walls, the laughter stored in every corner. But he had not lost himself. He still had his will. And with that will, he would fight. Not just for his home, but for the truth. The pain of losing his house would never fade completely, but it would not be the end. It would be the beginning of a battle he was ready to face. David lay awake in the small motel bed, staring at the ceiling. The ticking clock on the nightstand was the only sound in the room. Sleep refused to come. But for the first time in weeks, his sleeplessness was not just sorrow. It was determination. He had lost his home, but he had not lost the truth. And the truth deserved to be seen, a call to action. The next morning, David met with Mr. Harris again. They sat at a corner table in a quiet cafe, papers spread between them. Mr. Harris spoke with careful seriousness. "If Karen has done this to others," the lawyer said, "we need to find them. We need stories, records, anything that shows this was not a one-time event. Courts can ignore one man, but they can't ignore a pattern." David nodded. His face was tired, but his eyes carried a new fire. "Then that's what I'll do. I'll talk to people. I'll find them." It was a difficult task for someone who had just been broken, but David no longer wanted to stay silent. Knocking on doors. That week, David drove back into the neighborhood. He felt strange returning as a visitor, no longer a homeowner. He parked at the corner and walked door to door, knocking gently, introducing himself. Some neighbors were nervous. They looked over their shoulders before speaking, afraid of Karen and the HOA. But slowly, some began to open up. One family whispered about losing their backyard fence after an unpaid fine they never understood. Another man admitted his cousin had been forced to sell quickly after constant harassment from the HOA. Piece by piece, stories began to emerge. The fear was real, but so was the pain. David carried a small notebook, writing every detail. Finding allies one evening, David visited Linda again. She welcomed him inside with a warm smile and hot tea. Her living room felt safe, like a place where voices could be heard without fear. "People are scared," David told her, flipping through his notebook. "But they know something is wrong." Linda leaned forward, her voice steady. "They just need someone brave enough to lead." "And that person is you," David hesitated. "I already lost everything." "Which is exactly why you can't stop now," Linda said firmly. "They took your house, David, but they haven't taken your voice." Her words sank into his heart. He realized she was right. The first meeting with Linda's help, David organized a small gathering at her brother's garage outside the neighborhood. At first, only 4 people showed up. They sat on folding chairs, faces tense and guarded. David spoke gently, telling his own story first. He described how the foreclosure had been sudden, unfair, and cruel. He shared how it had broken him, but also how it had opened his eyes. As he spoke, the others began to nod. Slowly, one by one, they shared their own experiences. By the end of the night, the garage was filled not just with stories, but with a shared sense of injustice. People realized they were not alone. Building the case over the next few weeks, David and Mr. Harris gathered evidence. Documents, letters, and testimonies piled up. It was exhausting work, but David poured himself into it. Every paper felt like a piece of armor, every testimony a weapon of truth. Karen's name appeared again and again. Properties bought at unfair prices. Families pressured to leave. Fines that made no sense. Patterns of intimidation. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. Karen and the HOA had been abusing their power for years. Karen reacts, but Karen soon noticed what David was doing. One afternoon, as David left Linda's house, Karen stood waiting near his car. Her arms were crossed, her eyes sharp. "You just don't know when to quit," she said coldly. David stood tall, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "You took my house. You won't take my courage," Karen smirked. "You think you can win? People like you always lose. That's how the system works." David met her gaze without blinking. "Maybe, but even if I lose, the truth will stand. And you can't bury it forever. For the first time, Karen's expression faltered. She turned sharply and walked away. The courtroom. Battle finally, the day came. The case reached the courtroom. David sat at the plaintiff's table beside Mr. Harris. Across the room, Karen sat with her own lawyer, confident and composed. The trial stretched over hours, then days. Witnesses spoke. Documents were shown. David listened as neighbor after neighbor described unfair treatment, fines that grew without reason, threats that pushed families out. When it was his turn, David stood before the judge. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, strength filled his words. "This was my home," he said, holding up a photo of his family in the garden. "It wasn't just walls and a roof. It was where my wife's roses bloomed, where my daughter grew up. They took it from me for a debt that was smaller than my monthly grocery bill. They didn't give me time, they didn't give me fairness, and they've done this to others too. This is not about me anymore. This is about justice." The courtroom was silent when he finished. Even the judge's eyes softened. The verdict, after days of arguments and testimonies, the judge finally spoke. His words came slowly, carefully. "The evidence shows a pattern of abuse of power by the HOA leadership. The foreclosure process was conducted unfairly, without proper notice or opportunity for correction. The sale of Mr. David's property is hereby voided." David's heart stopped. Did he hear it right? The judge continued. "Mr. David will regain legal ownership of his home. Furthermore, an investigation will be launched into the HOA's practices. Restitution will be considered for other affected families." David's eyes filled with tears. He gripped the table, overwhelmed. Around the courtroom, neighbors quietly cheered. Karen's face turned pale. For once, her confidence had cracked. She tried to argue, but the gavel came down firmly. Returning home. The day David received the keys back was one of the most emotional of his life. He stood at the doorway, the same doorway he had once left with tears in his eyes. Now he held the keys tightly, almost afraid it was a dream. When he opened the door, the air smelled different, but the walls were the same. His footsteps echoed as before, but this time, each step carried triumph. He walked to the garden and found the roses still blooming. Their petals were brighter than ever, as if they had been waiting for him. He knelt, touched them gently, and whispered, "I'm home." A new beginning word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Families who had once been silent now began to speak. Investigations into the HOA continued, and many who had suffered found courage through David's example. Linda visited one afternoon, smiling warmly. "You did it, David. You didn't just save your house. You gave everyone hope." David looked at the house, then at the roses, then back at her. "I only wanted justice. But if hope comes with it, then it's worth everything." Closing scene that evening, David sat in his living room. The furniture was back, the photo frame stood tall once more. He held the album of memories and smiled. His wife's face looked back at him from the pictures. He whispered, "I kept it safe. I kept our home." The house was more than walls. It was love, history, and resilience. And though the scars of the battle would remain, they were now joined by strength. David had faced loss, sorrow, and injustice. But in the end, he had reclaimed not just his house, but his voice. His fight had become more than personal. It had become a story of courage, of standing against unfairness, and of the power of never giving up.